And of course, his own theories about, his own heteronormative theories about masculinity and the anima, men having a feminine side to their personality they need to bring to consciousness and integrate, and vice versa, women having a masculine side to their personality called the animus that they need to integrate. The result of that would be a certain kind of workable psychological androgyny. Mm-hmm. So in Jung's thought, identifying homosexuality with the androgyne is an extraordinarily positive thing to say. It's like potentially what he's saying is that, I'm putting words in his mouth, but he's saying like gay people are more advanced than heterosexuals because they have a little bit more access to both archetypes of the masculine and feminine in the way that heterosexual men and homosexual women have to work at.
Rob Hopcke, it's a real pleasure to meet you. Thanks a lot for joining me on the podcast.
My pleasure. Thanks, Brian. Good to be here.
I should have asked, do you mind if I call you Rob, or do you prefer Robert?
No, Rob is good. Thanks. Everyone calls me Rob.
Great. Well, I had actually a listener reach out and suggest that I get you on the podcast. I had done an episode with a guy named Jack Mason, who's also known as the Perfume Nationalist. He has a podcast where he looks at soap operas and perfume, and ends up doing a lot of cultural commentary. And the listener said, well, I really like this kind of perspective, examining kind of homosexuality in our culture, and what it was like in the 90s and all that. And he said, you should talk to Rob Hopcke. And I realized that I'd already heard you on this Jungian Life and really enjoyed, really enjoyed your kind of way of speaking, your playfulness and your openness. So I thought you'd be a really good guest to have on.
Well, cool. I'm glad to be here. As I say, I'm like 5 minutes or 5 hours, I'm ready to chat. So
good. That's great. Well, the interview that you did with this Jungian Life, I think, covered a lot of ground, but I was hoping to maybe go a little bit deeper on some particular topics. So let's just see where we go, I guess. But maybe to begin, okay, so you see yourself as a Jungian-oriented therapist, right? So you're not like a trained Jungian per se, is that right?
Yeah, so generally when somebody's referred to as a Jungian analyst here in the United States, what that means is that they've gone to one of the 4 Jung institutes and undergone a specific course of analytic training there, which is both didactic as well as practical. So Jungian analysts have been in analysis with a Jungian analyst themselves, and then they have what they call a training analyst, which is essentially a supervisor. And so therefore, then what happens is they generally at one of the 4 institutes, New York, Chicago, San Francisco, LA, and then there's an interregional society for folks that aren't in those cities. Then what happens is a Jungian committee gets together at those institutes and certifies someone as an analyst. They lay hands on them, they ordain them, they're a Jungian analyst. Okay, so generally when somebody says a Jungian analyst, that means they've been to an analytic institute and have gone through that process. So those of us who have not gone through that process, and I voluntarily did not go through that process for all kinds of reasons I can talk about, but didn't. Out of respect for their training, we refer to ourselves as Jungian-oriented psychotherapists.
Okay.
The training format in Europe is somewhat different and much less elaborate. So what happens is that each one of the individual countries has a Jung Society, the International Association of Analytical Psychologists has a whole bunch of different national societies. And like, say, in Italy, you enter analysis, long-term psychotherapy with a Jungian analyst, and that committee just basically gets together on the recommendation of your analyst and says, you're ready to be an analyst. It's just very simple. Here in the United States, it's my late husband was a sociologist of religion. One of the things that sociologists of religion consistently say about the United States is that all religions tend toward Protestantism here in the United States.
Mhm.
So the Jungian analytic training here looks a lot like a seminary. You do this 4-year degree, you get your MDiv, you go through an actual, certification process, and then you're ordained. Well, I had already been through seminary, so I was like, yeah, I'm not going to go through another seminary process to become a Jungian analyst. Plus, I also kind of felt like at the point that it would have made sense for me to do so, my career was pretty much already launched. I was already writing books. I was already, so I didn't really feel the need to. It wasn't going to enhance my professional capacity in any way, shape, or form, really. And in some ways, it would restrict it. Again,
Mm.
you would be kind of working within a specific community. And I think, kind of as an independent scholar, as an independent Jungian, I had, and still do, have more freedom, in a certain sense. Plus, I also say with the Jungians, starting with Jung, Jungians tend to be pretty introverted. And so a lot of time, and that's true about psychotherapists in general. So a lot of times psychotherapists feel a great need to kind of affiliate themselves with larger associations because as introverts, they don't naturally kind of develop communities around them. I'm pretty extroverted. I was extroverted Italian American. I had more friends and more communities than I could actually keep up with. So the last thing I needed to do was join another community. So I didn't really, as an extrovert, I didn't really feel like the need to have an additional sort of post licensure kind of training. So,
Mm.
but yeah, I've done all of my research at the Jung Institute here in San Francisco, and because given all the writing I've done and all the professional colleagues I've had, I'm pretty intimate with all of them here in San Francisco as well as in LA. So yeah, so that's the long story as to why I'm not a Jungian analyst and what actually being a Jungian analyst means. So.
Mhm. Did your being gay play a part in that decision? Like, did you feel welcome into that community, or what was that like?
Well, that's a really good question. And that's one of those that was then, this is now sort of kind of juxtapositions. It played a big part, to tell you the truth. I mean, at the time that let's go back to 1980. 1983. So I get my degree in pastoral counseling in 1983, and then I go to do a second master's degree in clinical counseling at California State University, Hayward here. And that's when I do my kind of independent study in studying Jung. So I get, I already have a degree in pastoral counseling, and I'm going to use that to get licensed. So I arrive at Hayward State, and my advisor, Dorlisa Ewing, who's Swiss, was sort of shocked that I had never read Jung in the course of my seminary studies. So she's like, well, you already have a degree in pastoral counseling that you're going to use to get licensed. So why don't we just set you up for this degree being an independent study with me? She was the head of the department. You sign up for the courses, but basically you'll meet with me once a week. And why don't you just read Jung? So that's what I did for 2 years. I started with volume 1. There are 18 volumes of the collected works. And they're kind of behind me here. I just started with 1 and started reading, which was not what I would recommend anyone do. It was kind of the most ridiculous thing in the entire world to do. But, I was 24. What did I know? And so as I'm reading through, as an out gay man who'd been out and pretty much a gay activist at Georgetown University when I did my undergraduate degree, helped found and establish the Gay People of Georgetown. We eventually sued Georgetown University with the ACLU for official recognition of that group and eventually won. So, as I'm reading through Jung in my graduate studies, I'm checking off every time he mentions homosexuality because I'm gay, I'm out. Nothing's been written on homosexuality within the Jungian literature in English at this point. So I'm checking all of that off, right? So here I am. I get through it, and I expect to go to the Jung Institute, and I'm gonna get the book on homosexuality. Well, there is no books. There's nothing written about it. And I was like, really? Here we are in 1986, and there's nothing written about it? Not to mention, I'm like, okay, I'm at Hayward State. What I want is, two gay, I need external readers for my thesis as part of the committee. There were 2 out gay male analysts at the time. This is San Francisco in 1986.
Hmm.
I mean, at the time, there were actually three. I mean, there was David Stockford and Michael Steele, who served on my committee of blessed memory. They've since passed on.
Hmm.
And at the time, there was the editor of the Jung Institute Library Journal, John Beebe, still alive, kicking, great guy, super supportive of me throughout everything. But there were only three out gay men at the Jung Institute in San Francisco. And there is a fourth one in the process, Scott Worth, who I co-edited a collection of papers with eventually on homosexuality and Jungian psychology. And he's being put through the ringer. But there's a bunch of closeted analysts. There are analysts who are married to women and yet having gay relationships on the side of both genders. But no one's out in 1986 in San Francisco. So I'm like, yeah, I'm not going back into the closet to become a Jungian analyst, nor am I going to subject myself at this point, already having had a decade of being an out gay activist, right? There's no way I'm going to subject myself to some of the, you know, I would say unconscious homophobia that was really clearly the case. There were a number of other out gay and lesbian candidates there who were eventually withdrew as well, that I knew. So I was like, okay, maybe things will get better there at some point, and maybe I'll reconsider that at some point. But at the time, absolutely not. So, you know, I will have to say, just in all frankness, that was then, back in the 80s, that was not a place that I really felt comfortable going to as an out gay man or psychotherapist, really. Not that I had to, not that I would be interested anyway, as I just sort of said. That said, they were enormously helpful and open to me using their library resources for all the research I did. You know, I mean, as long as I wasn't applying to become an analyst, everything was cool. So, you know, the library there was wide open. John Beebe was super supportive. I wrote probably half a dozen really very extensive and wonderful articles on various aspects of masculinity and homosexuality for the Jung Institute Library Journal during those years. The Library Journal, you know, what the Library Journal did was sort of like the New York Times Review of Books. They would, you know, you would pick a book and you would be ostensibly reviewing it, so to speak, but it would actually give you an opportunity to write a pretty extensive article on a particular topic if you really wanted to go in depth. And so, you know, as a young person who was just recently licensed, coming out with my own books, you know, Guided Tour of the Collected Works, the first book, and I wrote the first book in English on homosexuality and Jungian psychology. Jungian's Homosexuality came out in '89, right? They were very supportive of me. But again, never asked me to come and speak or do a public program on homosexuality there, even though I had done them in Chicago, in Los Angeles, and in New York. And here I am right across the bridge in Berkeley. I've never been asked to speak at the Jung Institute in San Francisco, ever. So I was like, oh, okay. You know, it's just sort of, it was an interesting thing. And then, you know, things have changed there. I mean, that was, you know, I would say at least 30 years ago, 35 years ago, right? Now it's very different, you know. For the longest time there during the early 2000s, Steve Manning, out gay man who had run 18th Street Services here in San Francisco, which was a gay male recovery program, he was hired as the executive director of the Jung Institute, out gay. Many of my gay male psychotherapy colleagues that I had sort of grown up with, so to speak, professionally in the 80s and 90s, eventually went on and applied. It's a very different place now, you know. I mean, it's a little bit like Georgetown when I went. Now, Georgetown has a gay and lesbian, you know, community center. They have a lavender graduation. I keep saying, like, I wish I could go to Georgetown now. Like, I didn't want to go back in 1976. I was like 50 years too early, you know? And it's the same with the Jung Institute. I mean, if the Jung Institute was the way it is now, I would have gone to become a Jungian analyst, but it wasn't then, you know?
Right.
So, yeah, that definitely played a large part in why I didn't go. And it's different. I mean, just to be fair, that's kind of how it was 30 years ago. But a lot of institutions in the United States were like that 30 years ago. Things are really, really different now in 2024. So
Yeah, it reminds me a bit of that old idea of like the best time to plant a tree if you want shade is like yesterday or 20 years ago, that kind of thing, right? Like you don't often
definitely.
get to reap the fruits of what you seed. Have people recognized you for that early work that you did in opening doors and breaking new ground?
Um, yes, definitely. Absolutely. I mean, I think not so much at the Jung Institute of San Francisco. In some ways, they don't need to because they have an entire cadre of very smart out gay male analysts there. They definitely don't need me. But I think at other places, definitely Chicago and LA, definitely for sure. In fact, I was saying to you, before we started, I was just being interviewed by this guy that's doing a documentary on this man named Purusha, who renamed himself Purusha. His real name was Peter Larkin, sort of a gay sex guru from the early 80s here in California. And, he had an interview in a book that I was included in called Leatherfolk that was edited by the former editor of The Advocate, the gay national gay magazine for the longest time. I think they're still in business. I just don't think they have a print edition any longer, like most magazines. Anyway, Mark Thompson, uh, you know, kind of into BDSM down in LA, also really smart, also an editor. Um, Put together a collection of first person stories on BDSM, gay male BDSM, called Leatherfolk, and then asked me to contribute the Jungian, more intellectual and theoretical understanding of what's going on with BDSM and gay men, right? And so Sam Ashby was here this morning, and so that's one of those things where having published what I published in '89, and having had not a whole lot published since then on any of that, people kind of have to come to me. I'm sort of like the standard work, which is a little awkward in some ways. I mean, there's sort of that. There's that piece of it, as well as I think I do a lot of the work behind the scenes. I mean, Pacific Graduate Institute, which provides master's and doctoral degrees down in Santa Barbara here in California, Carpinteria, just north of Santa Barbara. They have lots of queer students, gay, lesbian, bi, trans, non-binary students come through doing doctoral work on topics of the GLBTQ, of GLBTQ interest. And so for 20 years, I've been regular part of people's doctoral committees as kind of an external reader on that, because again, my work has been pretty fundamental. I mean, what Jungian's homosexuality, just to sort of say, what Jungian's homosexuality did was I documented everything Jung had said. Then I did a whole study on the secondary sources. In other words, what Jungian analysts had said since Jung about it, critiqued it, and then put forward my own ideas about masculinity, femininity, and the androgyne as how those three archetypes in particular work within the individual gay men's psyche, as well as the gay male community.
Mm-hmm.
And my thought really was that would just be the first of an entire avalanche of books on, non-heterosexual sexualities from the Jungian point of view. And that didn't happen. Karen Carrington, Scott Worth, and I put together a collection of papers from various Jungian voices, male, female, called Same-Sex Love, A Path to Wholeness. But really, there's not been a whole lot, until recently. So that's what's, again, very interesting, probably sat on, I don't know, probably 15 to 20 dissertation committees over the years, easily. Some of the topics just super interesting. And some of them are now going to be published. I think using some of Jung's classic ideas as to how they apply to queer people's experience. So yeah, some of them are going to be published, and some of them are just super interesting. I mean, one was on asexuality as a sexual orientation. Another one was on studied heterosexual couples in which one couple gender transitioned and how that worked itself out for them, right? Another one, very sort of edgy one, by Gaetano, can't remember his last name at the moment. Gaetano ran the Gay and Lesbian Counseling Center for the LA Gay Center. Vaccaro, Gaetano Vaccaro, wrote one on brother-brother incest, which is, brothers who had grown up having sex with one another. And, the surprisingly positive aspect of it, that those folks, so we've had some really great and interesting kind of dissertations come through Pacifica, that I was privileged to sort of sit on the committee for. So yeah, that's what's happening now. So the sort of like, again, what I thought might happen 30 years ago is kind of coming to pass now, I think, with a different generation, with a younger generation. So yeah, I'm kind of the old dude that everyone eventually kind of gets around to talking to.
Hey, I want to take a moment to speak with you about this channel. Currently, only 11% of viewers are subscribed to the channel. I think those numbers are terrible. So if you're enjoying this content and you want to help out the channel, please take a moment right now to like this video and subscribe. And if you really want to help out the channel, you can become a member of the Howl in the Wilderness Patreon, which will give you access to early release of full ad-free episodes, plus access to the archive of the first 100 episodes of this podcast. It would really help me out and allow me to keep creating content like the interview that you're watching right now. Okay, thanks so much. Now, back to the interview. Well, that is a common theme in gay erotica, is the role of the older male as initiator.
Well, and again, that's one of those things that I wrote about kind of back when, because I think it's kind of an archetypal pattern. It's not just in contemporary gay male erotica, but it's a cultural pattern that goes back across culture for a long, long period of time. I mean, certainly everyone knows about, well, maybe not everyone knows about, but one of the more famous places where you sort of see that particular pattern is in classical Greece, right? In which there's an older man who's initiating a younger man. What's interesting about that, and I think there's an entire literature now kind of studying that. In particular, I heard a podcast from BBC Extra, the BBC history podcast, on what they call sodomites. I mean, I guess it's now the custom in historical studies to refer to same-sex relationships as sodomites, because using the word gay is a little bit of an anachronistic retrojection onto how they understood that. But yeah, he was talking about the classical Greek pattern of older men and younger men as part of, social initiation, as part of military initiation, and kind of how that developed. And of course, that's the case in other cultures as well. I mean, so one of the things that I wrote about in the article in Leatherfolk, which was sort of the initiatory symbolism quality experience that often kind of happens between gay men. Sort of, so the older younger pairing is definitely an archetype, and so is the brother twin archetype. Those are two kind of typical patterns of male relationship that you see that sort of transcend culture and time, and therefore are what I would call archetypal patterns of homosexual relationship. Right.
And interesting that both of those, the brother and the older man, younger man, are I think pretty prevalent motifs in gay porn.
Well, I think they're prevalent in gay porn for kind of two reasons. I mean, I think they're prevalent in gay porn because that's often the experience people have actually had, right? If I'm 14 or 15 or 16 and I'm in the middle of puberty and I'm homosexually oriented, it's not all that uncommon for me to seek out, or actually conversely be vulnerable to, an older, more experienced gay man who's interested in kind of having sex with me. So I have to say, I think it's not at all an uncommon experience that individuals actually have. in their actual sexual development, so consequently is eroticized and therefore written about as part of gay erotica, right?
Mhm.
But
Well,
then
and
we go,
also it's also taboo, which kind of makes it hot, right?
well, I was just going to go to like the psychoanalytic piece of it, right? So let's just say you didn't have that experience. I mean, if I'm gay, most people's sexual orientation, they're, I when I taught human sexuality at Institute for Transpersonal Psychology, which I did for about 15 years, but it would be an all day Saturday, all day Sunday. And so at lunch on Saturday, what I would do is I would take an informal sex survey of the students, anonymous. So I'd ask them 6 questions. I would say, at what point did you become aware of your sexuality? At what point did you become aware of your gender? When was the first time you masturbated? When was the first time you had sex with another person? And how frequently do you masturbate currently per week? And how frequently do you have intercourse with another person per week? Again, have to be very specific, because if you say have sex, people sometimes feel like masturbation is having sex. So I want to have to be another person, right? So what happened was that I think I would find out from those surveys, like, people became aware of their sexual orientation usually between the ages of like 3 and 11. Some people would say from birth, some people would be way over here and say 25, but most folks, from 3. So from 3 to about 11, latency period, people became aware of their sexual orientation. So let's just say you become aware of your sexual orientation at age 4 or 5. I mean, you're going to be, your first erotic objects are going to be family members, right?
Mhm.
I mean, it's going to be directed at your older brothers. It's going to be directed at your father if you happen to be gay. So I feel like, yeah, that's part of it. I mean, that's the gay version of the Oedipal complex, the classic Oedipal complex that Freud talks about, right? That then subsequent psychoanalytic writers like Richard Issay basically say, yeah, sure, that makes a lot of sense. I mean, of course, your family members are going to be the first objects of your erotic attention, and that's why it's taboo.
Mhm.
Right? Because if you act that out and bind yourself erotically and emotionally to a family member, you're never going to individuate and become your own person. It becomes incestuous in a problematic way, right? Which is why it's so taboo. But of course, as you just said, the taboo quality of it increases his eroticism,
Right.
right? Because who doesn't want to do something that's forbidden? And then on top of it, we're talking about sex. We're not just talking about eating a chocolate brownie. We're talking about like something that's really culturally charged. So
Well,
there's
especially in a Protestant culture.
and a Catholic culture and an Indian culture.
Maybe less
Really.
so. Maybe less so. I mean, if you look at Indian art, there's a lot of phalluses, a lot of sex depicted, far, far less repressed, I think, than here in Anglo North America.
Well, I again, having heard from gay men of, Southeast Asian and Asian in general, I don't know, it's a different category. They're not welcomed for sure,
Mhm.
or it strikes me a little bit, as I said, I'm Italian American. It strikes me a little bit of the way it is in Italy, which is, as long as you get married to a woman and have kids, you can do whatever you want to do on the side with whomever you want to do it. Just don't make it a public part of your identity, right?
Mhm.
But that too is a certain kind of compartmentalization. That's not exactly what you and I, from our Western and American way of thinking, would call an integrated or affirmative attitude toward homosexuality. And of course, that has its consequences too. But in any
Mhm.
way, what I would say is, yeah, sure, taboo, I think, increases it. But that's also why I think it's part of, get back to our original topic. That's also why I think same-sex relationships, brother, brother, father, son, or older man, younger man, are part of gay male erotica. It's not just the actual experience people have actually had in their sexual development, but it's also the fantasy quality of it. If I never acted it out with my dad or never acted it out with my brother, one way of doing that vicariously is to either write or read an erotic story in which that's the case.
Hmm. Or find a daddy figure at the bathhouse, or
Well, you're talking to somebody who's age 66, so I can tell you that is absolutely true. That is
So
absolutely true. I mean, I have to say,
you get more desirable in gay culture as you age, if you know if you
well,
wear it well, I suppose.
well, yeah, whether you like it or not, I would say in a certain sense. I mean, I guess I would just say personally, I feel the target of a great I feel that like I'm the target of a large number of younger men's projections.
Right. Yeah.
Right. So I feel like there's definitely that, to the point where, on some of my like dating profiles now, my husband passed away 12 years ago, and since I've been single, so I'm like on some of my dating profiles, I'm like, don't call me daddy. I'm like, and they're like, why not? And I'm like, I'm a therapist, like I have to deal with incest victims and the trauma of sexual abuse. I'm like, it's the least erotic thing you could
Yeah.
possibly project onto me,
Right. And
right?
you're
But
trained to kind of deflect transference at a certain point, right?
but yeah, like I get paid for that. I don't have to do that in my
Right. You don't want to do that work. Yeah.
whole life. So
Like,
I will
do you,
say, yes, that is true. I mean, which is nice. It's been a kind of a nice discovery, that I'm,
sure.
so
Yeah, like a second flowering after midlife.
it could be, I mean, the other piece of it, of course, is the sugar daddy piece of it, and
Right. Yeah, save me,
that's the other
daddy.
part. That's the other part of it. I think,
Hmm.
20 something, 30 somethings wanting to crawl into an older man's life and just, prolonging their childhood indefinitely, instead of actually individuating.
Yeah, that's interesting. I was just going to ask you if you thought that that kind of idealization of the daddy figure is a sign of arrested psychological development. But I also want to like tie in the senex puer archetype here.
Well, I think that's how I would tie the two together, right? I mean, if we just want to kind of take a step and sort of do a bit of a, I don't know, like a theoretical orientation, right? I mean, Jung felt that Jung's idea of the archetypes of the collective unconscious is based on the idea that just by virtue of being human, all human beings share in certain fundamental experiences, right? Certain fundamental experiences of themselves in the world, called those archetypal experiences, right? We all have a mother, we all have a father, we all have an experience of youth, we have an experience of aging, we have an experience of wholeness, we have an experience of, disintegration, experience of femininity, masculinity, androgyny, etc. Those are all archetypal experiences. And because we share them with all human beings, they all have certain characteristics in common, and yet each of our experiences is individual, right? And in general, we will sort of walk around unconscious of the fact of these commonalities of experience that we have with everyone else. Hence, they're unconscious, and they're kind of a collective unconscious, right? So sometimes people get very, I don't know, kind of befuddled by that terminology, the archetypes of the collective unconscious. But I think like I just said, I think it's easily explainable. And it's kind of almost common sense if you think about it, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, with regard to that, because they're unconscious, Jung felt that at times people, rather than coming from their own individual standpoint with relationships to these long-standing and powerful patterns of behavior, allowed the archetypes to kind of take over and direct their behavior in ways that was unconscious and therefore potentially problematic, right? So as you're saying, I think senex and puer, a lot of times the Jungians would apply Latin terminology to the archetypal experience, hence senex, which means old man in Latin, puer, which means young boy in Latin. The senex puer is the way that Jungians would talk about the archetypal experience of being old, the archetypal experience of being young in male terms, right? There are other terms for that if you're female. So the senex puer archetype, yeah, is an archetype. The problem, of course, is how conscious or unconscious are you of doing that, right? So you use the term very accurately, idealization, right? Idealization, I can even kind of deconstruct to some extent. So what an idealization is, technically speaking, is when somebody has a psychological investment in seeing only the good because they can't tolerate the ambiguity or the bad.
Mm-hmm.
It's characteristic of a particular developmental point in our development in which the child is born, has an experience of the first year of being held, slowly comes to consciousness awareness. Around ages 2 to 4, most of us get up on our own 2 feet and start walking and acquire enough usable language to make ourselves understood, right? So that's the point at which we begin asserting ourselves in some fashion. And that's kind of a crucial point in our development. Now, up to then, we don't even really have the neurological capacity to deal with that much complexity, right? I mean, so things are either good or bad. You know, if 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 mommy doesn't let us have the lollipop we want and we're frustrated and angry because we've just come into our own self-assertiveness and independence and autonomy, and she's not letting me have it, she's a bad mommy, period. End of sentence. I'm only 4 years old. I don't have the capacity to see my mother in all of her complexity, nor do I have the capacity to comprehend the entire situation as to why this would not be good for me to have a lollipop, right?
Mm-hmm.
So she is all bad. But if she gives me that lollipop and I get what I want, she is all good. There is no bad in her. She is wonderful because I am happy. So that kind of split between good and bad is characteristic of that particular point in development when we have developed a certain level of autonomy and have individuated enough to actually assert ourselves in the world and to try to get our way. When we don't get our way, nature has endowed us with rage.
Mm-hmm.
So whenever, which is a self-preservation, an emotional self-preservation function, right?
Mm-hmm.
If we want to eat and we are not getting our food and something is keeping it from us, we get enraged in order to get our food and survive, you know?
Mm-hmm.
So rage is a self-protective, positive, instinctive, evolutionary development in human, right? Human development. So generally when someone idealizes someone, it dates to that particular period and all of those issues. So one of the things that we frequently say from an analytic point of view is that idealization is generally a defense against rage, right? It is a point at which we can't integrate what's bad, wrong, or infuriating about the situation. So we cover it over with an idealization. Now, there's no more natural focus for emotional ambivalence than our own parents, father and mother, right? We both completely 100% depend on them and know we depend on them throughout our childhood for our own survival. And yet they're often experienced and can be actual obstacles to our individuation, to our own independence, you know? We frequently say too that, you know, the parent-child relationship is the only relationship that grows most naturally and healthily towards separation, right? Most people grow toward intimacy with one another. This relationship is meant to grow towards separation. And so that's what I sort of see behind, you know, a long way of saying that's sort of what I see behind the idealization of an older person, you know, a daddy, is, you know, this developmental point at which people kind of don't want to grow up.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what Jung, or, you know, Jungians in the more technical way would say is like, if there's a senex puer dynamic going on archetypally, what we're talking about is something that's not in service of someone's actual individuation, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because what happens frequently is that the archetypes are almost always, as Jung said, kind of organized around polarities. There's a good mother and a bad mother archetypally. There's a, so there's an old and there's a young, right? Whenever you see those polarities, if you're identified with one end of the polarity, then you're projecting the other end of the polarity. But the point is, for everyone, all archetypal experiences are potentially available to all of us. So if I'm projecting one half of that polarity out onto a daddy figure, I'm not in touch with my own maturity, my own age, my own groundedness, my own capacity to take care of myself. I've identified with the child, I'm projecting the father. Or vice versa. You know, there are plenty of men my age cruising for younger guys around here, right? And I want to say, like, okay, if you're identified with the Sanex, if you're identified with the old man, and you aren't in touch with your youthfulness, your energy, the future, the things that the child part of you that's represented, and you think you're going to import that into your life by scoring a 23-year-old boyfriend, or, you know, paying for one, paying for a 23-year-old boyfriend to come in your life, that's going to impede your psychological development, in this case, in your later life. You know, you're depriving yourself of an experience of developing those qualities internally. So he felt like these projections were natural. He felt like people naturally projected out what it is they needed to then recollect and integrate. And that's what we do a lot of looking at in Jungian therapy, Jungian-oriented therapy and Jungian analysis. So like, what are you projecting? Why? Why is it unconscious? How can we make it conscious? And sometimes, you know, you and I were joking about your dreams last night. So a lot of times those potentialities are presented to us in the course of dreams or dream figures. But equally, as you know, this kind of according to the tenor of what you and I are talking about today, also presented in art. You know, the erotic fantasies, pornography, just regular conventional art, all the different narratives, movies, books, stories that we tell, you know, are ways in which we work out the multiplicity of who we are internally.
Yeah, that's great. Do you think also idealization could be, like you said, it was a defense against anger or rage, but don't you think it could also be a defense against the anxiety that's provoked when faced with complexity? And so if you have an inability to tolerate complexity or ambiguity, that might create some anxiety, and then you would regress into this idealization, just to like simplify things, right? Put them in an easy black and white category.
Absolutely. And you see that everywhere. I
Well,
mean,
that's
I
what I
think,
was thinking about culture now. There's a lot of that going on. Yeah.
It's a very rich time to be an analytically oriented Jungian at this time.
Yeah,
I mean,
if your archetypal eye is open, you're seeing these things play out everywhere, right?
everywhere. And I feel like that's one of the things that I, in a way, sort of hold myself to being in my life, which is sort of a bit of an agent of consciousness around this. You know, yeah, you can pretty much pick any social or political situation, and you know what you're going to hear is, "Oh my, the positions are so quote unquote polarized," and I'm like, "Yeah, they're pretty polarized." You know, uh, that's what, you know. Again, kind of maybe this is turning into a little bit of a intro to Jung talk here, right?
That's great.
I mean, it's why I think Jung, even, well, Jung, who lived through, as a Swiss person, lived through World War II and the Nazi era, right? Said, subsequent to that experience, that he felt that the most crucial moral issue of that century, of our time, was integration of the shadow, right? We all have an ego. We all have our own conscious sense of self. There's who we are and who we think we are, you know. And then there are all these various other aspects of our personality, sometimes authentic, sometimes just in potentia, sometimes potential, that, yeah, we don't like about ourselves, we don't really want anyone to see, we ourselves don't want to really acknowledge. Jung felt everything that was not the ego was in the shadow. I sometimes say right at the beginning of my intro to Jung courses that Jung felt, and I think with reason, that consciousness was pretty fleeting, sort of like a little bit like lighting a match in a huge dark room, right? I mean, and I think that's kind of true. I mean, most of us walk around our lives just because of so much input that's coming into our awareness at all times with a very narrow awareness, very narrow consciousness. We have to screen an awful lot out in order to just function, right? So, consciousness is sort of rare and hard won, right?
Mhm.
So consequently, times 100 when it comes to things like the shadow aspects of our own personality that we don't really even like ourselves, or who have been condemned or would be condemned or attacked by others. We hide all of that stuff way far away, right? So
Put it
that's
in
the
the closet.
essential internal. I'm sorry.
We put it in the closet, so
We
to
put it
speak.
in the closet. We hide it underneath, and then those some of
Mhm.
the that's some of the imagery that comes across, of course, in people's dreams, right?
Mhm.
They like open the door and something, well, there's that, or they looked under the thing, or there's something's coming up from underneath the ground, or something's coming up, so the
Mhm.
shadow side of it. So that's what he felt like. The shadow of our own personalities, he said, was the most crucial moral issue, because if you aren't aware of your own shadow, if you don't take responsibility for the parts of yourself that you hate and don't like, sometimes they've been wounded, sometimes they've been condemned, then you are not going to have the capacity to perceive another person in their complexity.
Mhm.
And that is exactly what's happening in so many situations. I mean, you can see it all over the place,
Mhm.
right? I mean, it's actually become kind of almost sort of a trope in political discourse, right? It's sort of this take no prisoners discourse in which the other side isn't someone I just disagree with. They're like fundamentally ontologically evil,
Yeah, demonic. Yeah. Mhm.
demonic, exactly. And you really can apply that to almost any situation. Whereas I am transcendentally good.
Of course.
And so whenever I hear that, I think when any of us Jungians hear whenever Jungians
The,
hear
the
that,
ears
right?
prick up, right? We're like,
Like, okay, well, we've got some work to do here, right? Now, as I know from my own individual work with people, as you can well believe, I do not treat thousands of people. I only treat a few. And that's because most people don't come into psychotherapy unless they are absolutely forced to by circumstances. It's a
Mhm.
matter of life or death. They have tried every way possible to avoid the suffering that they're experiencing, and none of it has worked.
Mhm.
And so, consequently, very reluctantly, they come in and pay me and help for help.
Yeah.
Right? They've done everything they've done everything they possibly can to do that, and a lot of times put their own lives at risk. I mean, especially if they're self-medicating in order to avoid these problems, definitely put their own lives at risk. Until such time as the very rare 1 in 10 has decided, oh, okay, I don't want to die. I maybe get a handle on this. That's when people start looking at the shadow. But that's why Jung said, the most crucial moral issue of our time was the integration of our own shadows. And
Mhm.
so whenever I hear that kind of polarized discourse, I just like, yeah. Um, it's almost always, I say this to my clients, I'm like, my job here is to make your life more complex, not simple.
Yeah.
You've simplified it, and that's why you're having a problem.
Mhm.
Whereas you are more complex than I think you realize, and the situation, therefore, is more complex than you've been able to handle. And let's skill you up for dealing
Mhm.
with ambivalence and ambiguity, because we can do that. I've been doing it for many years. It can definitely happen, but that takes some time. It takes some work,
Mhm.
and it's, as you said, and very anxiety provoking, very
Yeah.
very anxiety provoking. Yeah.
Yeah. Look, I mean, let's just stick with this for a moment. It's kind of like off our main topic, but I think it's really instructive, and I want to take the opportunity to pick your brain about this. So, one of the things that's required to tolerate ambiguity, complexity, uncertainty, anxiety is a strong and mature ego. So, you have to kind of help someone develop that before you can start to dig into the shadow stuff and dealing with complexity and tension of the opposites and all that stuff. So, what are some of the ways that can be helpful for someone to develop a stronger, more tolerant ego?
That's such an excellent question. And very Jungian, you know. I mean, you're very Jungian because
I
I
thought it
guess
was more Kohutian.
well, in general, sort of self-psychology in general, I would say, right? Um, yeah, I would say that it's very Jungian because I guess Jung was very interested in growing the health of the psyche rather than treating the pathology. He felt he
Hmm.
felt rightly or wrongly, I mean, it was somewhat of a projection onto Freud and Freudians. He felt that Freudians and generally psychology was very pathologizing, whereas he felt that the psyche was like a naturally evolved organ of the human experience.
Hmm.
And so he felt like our bodies are sort of endowed with a natural healing process to keep us healthy for as long as it can. Likewise, psychologically. So it was a very sort of his attitude toward the psyche was very positive.
Hmm.
Like in other words, if you see something that looks weird or perverted or damaged, there's a reason for it, and it's probably that way because that's the best way the psyche could figure out how to handle what it was given or held. So maybe I'm, in a way, sort of answering my own question, at least in answering the question, at least initially, which is to say, I think one of the best ways, I think, to develop one of the first and best ways to develop a healthy ego is to adopt that attitude, right? To look at oneself with a level of compassion and understanding rather than with an attitude of condemnation or judgment or rejection.
Which is usually, I mean, I think something that we take on from the culture or from the family of origin, right? Like what's not acceptable in culture, in the family, we internalize as some kind of judge or parochial figure.
Correct. And and sometimes that's even bumped up to an even more damaging level when someone as a child has been abused physically, emotionally, or sexually, right? In which they're experiencing pain and they're being told by their abuser they're responsible for the pain that they're feeling, right?
Hmm.
So it's just whether you have the sort of generic internalization of parental and cultural mores, or you have the more specific damaging aspect of abuse. Correct.
Hmm.
That's one of the first things you have to do, which is why, we therapists kind of cultivate a non-reactive, non-judgmental open space when clients come in. The whole idea is like, okay, before we leap to judge this, why don't we seek to uh, delineate it and then understand it?
Hmm.
Why did this happen? Why is this happening? Let's look at the origins of it. Let's go back and find out. Now, obviously, there are times when people, and I do, hold them responsible for some of their own really terrible decisions that they've made. Of course, that's piece of it. But I think that's always within the context of a certain level of like openness, positivity, and compassion. Let's understand that.
Yeah.
Because I think, you know, consequently, and I think psychology really has not done a great job on this quite yet. But, for a while, there was an entire kind of movement to research and figure out how people developed healthy self-esteem, right? Everyone's like, you have a damaged sense of yourself and you treat pathology. Well, how do people develop healthy self-esteem, right?
Hmm.
And that's
Positive psychology. Yeah.
positive psychology. That's one of the ways that they do that. The folks that I do not see in my practice are folks whose parents basically gave them the benefit of the doubt, gave them a lot of space to make mistakes, gave them unconditional love when they did, provided for them adequately, obviously weren't perfect. The parents have their own prejudices, quirks, failures, situations occurred, even for the best parents of possible, which they weren't able to economically, psychologically, or emotionally provide for the child due to no fault of their own, etc. The child suffers from that. But if a child is given a basically positive sense of self by their parents, basically positive sense of self, they come out of their childhood with healthy self-esteem and a certain level of confidence. And I don't see them. Doesn't mean their lives are going all that well, but they have a certain kind of confidence in their ability to do that. To basically handle the challenges of life. So I feel like that's the first and most fundamental answer to the question, like, how does somebody develop this healthy sense of ego? But I think, we can kind of, pick out some of the things I just said, kind of delineate those. One of them I consistently demonstrate and practice in therapy is suspend judgment and investigate. Like, it would be really interesting if people didn't leap to judging themselves or others and sort of set that aside enough to be able to inform themselves as to what the whole situation looks like. Let's just investigate this. I'm curious about this, right? I'm constantly sort of saying this. I have a client who was talking to me about a really intractable conflict that he has with his husband about, I'm not going to go into it just for confidentiality purposes, but due to one of the more charged issues of our day, let's just say. And when this issue comes up, the client's husband says, I don't feel safe talking about this. And that generally shuts down the discussion. And I said to the client, how about exploring that? Like, what's unsafe? I was like, if he were sitting here and he said that to me in therapy, many clients have said that to me, I don't feel safe telling you this. I'm like, you don't have to tell me, but let's explore the safety issue. Let's just explore it. Let's get curious. I'm curious about it. Tell me more, tell me more, tell me more, right? So I feel like what that entails is a capacity to listen, right? If you ask someone to explore it, then you better sit there and listen. And I think that's a skill that a lot of folks are really terrible at, frankly.
Yeah.
I do understand, because I myself needed years of training to learn how to listen to people. So I definitely don't think it's something that, you just sprout out of nowhere. Definitely takes a lot of training. But again, that would be number two. Like, how about listening? Now, again, in individual psychotherapy, that takes a bit of a different shape, because what I'm encouraging people to do is listen to themselves, right? But then we get to maybe, the higher level skill of being self-reflective. Again, not something I'm terribly impressed with most people's ability to engage, especially around a politically, emotionally, culturally charged topic. I'd be like, a little self-reflection would go a long way here.
Which then requires objectivity.
Well, yeah, if only we can achieve that, that would be great.
Well, something reaching toward objectivity anyway, to get out of your own ass, and
that's the ultimate goal. That's the town we're aiming to get at, right? But that's how you get there. It's like self-reflection, listening, curiosity, the presumption of goodness, a sort of basic positive orientation toward these things. Those are all, as much as helpful as they are interpersonally, I feel like that's the large answer to the original question. Like, how does one develop a healthy ego? And those are the skills that go into developing a healthy sense of self, self-reflection, listening to yourself, not immediately passing judgment, basically presuming the best.
Yeah, one of the things I find myself asking for is like to consider all the other possibilities, not just the one that hurts you most personally, like dealing with some interpersonal conflict or a conflict at work or something. It's like, let's just take some time to play around with, like, what could also be the motivation for what happened and that kind of thing, you know? So bringing it into an area of play and imagination, I think is helpful to expand, the perspective.
Definitely, absolutely. You know, again, part of part of not so much Jung, but subsequent Jungians, you know, having engaged in, well, Jung himself definitely encouraged his clients to engage in play in the sense of art, creating
Mhm.
artwork out of their imagery, etc. Right? But again, another, you know, get it out of the head, get it out of the verbal modality, get it into the material, you know, get it into an objective form in which I can look at it. It's not just internal and
Yeah.
psychological, but it's
Get it
here.
into the space between us that we're creating through this dialogue, right? Hmm.
Right. And of course, then his subsequent followers have created the entire technique of sand tray,
Hmm.
right? In which you have this open sand tray and you have a wide collection of figures, and people create various scenes using these figures in the sand tray. But yeah, play, yeah, play would be a really good, what would I say, sort of a really good modality to engage a lot of times, especially when you get really hooked. You know, when you're
Yeah, when
really
you're
hooked.
really charged and you're like really tight and constricted around an idea. Yeah.
Right. Yeah,
Yeah.
sometimes that um that's represented by a sense of humor,
Mhm.
right? I mean, humor requires a certain level of stepping back from the situation and sort of seeing it in some ways. It absolutely is key to defusing certain interpersonal conflicts. I mean, I'm sort of known for it as a psychotherapist.
Yeah, me too.
Clients are like, thank God you have a sense of humor. I'm like, yeah, well,
Yeah, it can also be a defense, right? But I always tell clients like if we are laughing about a problem in their life that they came in really kind of feeling the weight of, and we're laughing about the end of the, I said, you know, the laughter, your ability to laugh about this is, I think, is a sign of health. And it goes back to what you're talking about with Jung, that it's more about growing yourself bigger than your problems, so that the problems are much smaller in context, in this larger context of who you are and you know, what your beliefs are about yourself and the world, right? So like for me, like humor expands.
yeah, yeah. Yeah, and that would be, I think, one of the goals of individuation process and therefore Jungian analysis, which is an expansion of the personality. You know, you want to grow yourself bigger so that you contain the complexity of it all, right? Also,
Yeah.
humor too requires a certain level of distance from the situation, and therefore, you know, the objectivity you're talking about. You know,
Hmm.
because you get, you know, all of us get very involved in kind of the minutiae, you know, of our lives, and it's time to kind of take a step back and look at it, and then,
Hmm.
you know, and then of course, if you can laugh laugh at yourself, you actually have it be, you know, like, really, I'm really getting this twisted about
Yeah,
this.
no.
Really?
Well, to me, that kind of humor has always been a part of gay identity.
Oh yeah, I mean, it's I would say almost a weapon.
Well, it can be weaponized, right? For sure. Yeah.
You know, I mean, a weapon in the sense of a weapon in service of our self-defense. You know
Yeah.
what I mean?
Yeah.
Like, in
If
other
you
words,
if you don't have the physical brawn to defend yourself, you might have a sharp, you have to develop a sharp tongue, right?
well, all you have to do is tune into any of the 15 seasons of RuPaul's Drag Race to see it, right? You know, I have to
Yeah.
say, like,
The
oh my
reading.
God, that's the reason I watch it. I'm just like, oh
Mm.
my God, these girls are so funny. But, you know, obviously, like, cutting defensive weapon uh, for their own survival, right?
Yeah.
Just incredible. And of course, borrowed from communities of color, frequently borrowed from communities of color, you know,
Hmm.
which did the same, you know, sort of using biting, trenchant humor in order to defend, right?
Hmm.
So defend themselves against what was coming at them, oppressive. But yeah, absolutely. You know, that's why we have camp. That's why we have drag. I mean, that's certainly definitely one of the, I think, yeah, bitchy queen stereotype of gay men, man. Just like, don't get it. Boys in the Band. I mean, if you want to spend a whole evening of like, defensive trenchant gay humor, that would be the show to go see or the movie to run.
Well, that's interesting. I just talked to Glenn Belverio, who is an artist and activist, but he was doing a lot of work in the '90s in New York City, and he brought up Boys in the Band too. So this is a real touchstone for a gay man of a certain generation. I haven't seen it. I've
Oh,
seen clips of it on his old public access show. Tell me a little bit about that. Why does it keep coming up?
well, yeah. I think it came out at a very specific time in American history that actually predates gay liberation. I mean, it
It's like
could be wrong.
pre-Stonewall.
Pre-Stonewall.
Mhm.
Yeah, just immediately pre-Stonewall, 68, 67, 68.
It's a
And
Hollywood movie, right?
well, it was originally a Broadway play and then became a movie. So when it came out as a play, it was probably off Broadway. I mean, again, I could get a lot of these production details wrong. I guess people will correct you when they hear this, right? But it came out, broadly speaking, at a time long before gay liberation, and so it was kind of this window into a particular a particular what do I say, milieu, gay milieu that was very common in New York City at the time, in which all of these men were basically in the closet, and all of whom had developed various kinds of personality conformations in order to cope with that situation. Some of them were highly sexualized, some of them were drinking too much, some of them were married to women and cheating on their husbands, some of them were neurotic Jewish queens. They were all sort of like, it was like this, what do I want to say, sort of pantheon of
Mhm.
closeted gay archetypes, all in a single drawing room drama, which no one had ever seen on stage before. So it was kind of a cultural earthquake, really. And this again was long before gay liberation, right? And in a way, um, I'll say pathetically accurate, right?
Mm,
None of these characters was especially positive. you
right.
know, they were all pretty tormented,
Not
which
aspirational.
not yet non-aspirational, all pretty tormented, I would say. So that's why I think,
Mm,
it kind of has it has this sort of archetypal place in American theater and in American gay culture, and it's sort of a touchstone for all of us. That's why I mention it, right? Because it's indicative of a almost sociologically indicative of a particular way that gay men had to figure out how to survive within a culture in which they could be killed or go to jail just for kissing someone in a bar
mhm.
you know so that's why I think we talk about Boys in the Band.
Okay. Is it sort of like kind of like the Gilligan's Island thing? Like, out of all these archetypes, which one are you most like? So do gay men go, oh, he's just like Larry and Boys in the Band? Or
Well, it's the craziest thing because I don't know if you know, but there was a Broadway revival of this probably about 10 years ago. My sister and I went to go see it. And I'll tell you, like, I thought I was going to see this dated theater piece from like way back when.
Mhm. With some campy
But
charm kind of thing.
yeah, um, it was like ripped from the headlines. This was
Really?
like a dinner party I had just been to the weekend before, and I was like, "Well, there's him, and there's him, and there's oh my god, there's him, and there." I'm like, "Oh shit! You mean like nothing's changed in 40 years?" It was really like, "Wow, okay," and it was sort of sad in a particular way, right? I was just like, "Oh my, I thought we would pretty much get past this," but in fact it's every generation is
Mhm.
facing kind of the same thing. I think I will just say these were all, well, with one exception, white men. There's an African American character, all white men. So I feel like it's a particular upper middle class white gay male milieu. So to
Okay.
that extent, I would not say it's representative of the gay community. This is definitely representative of that milieu, right? And so I was just like, whoa, okay, there it is. And get back to our main topic, hysterically funny.
Mhm.
I mean, funny in ways you don't want it to be funny, but really very, very funny.
Yeah,
Right.
like the kind of ouch that hits a little close.
So that's where I'm going with this, right? I mean, people may not be especially familiar of Freud's essay Wit and its relationship to the unconscious, its relation to the unconscious, but it's not that hard to read. I would suggest people go, it's a tiny little book, go read it. Freud's view of humor is that it is a sublimation of aggression. We can't be aggressive in civilization. We have to mute our aggression in order to coexist with people. So, not that we don't feel it, and not that aggression is bad. Aggression is kind of a self-preservational force like rage. But you just can't act your aggression out violently in all cases. And so Freud's thought is humor is the way we sublimate it. So when you go ouch, you're like, absolutely. I'm always talking to people about that. I'm like, behind humor is an aggressive intention at some place. Somewhere in there, there's an aggressive intention, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I'm like, sometimes it's your own unconscious. Mm-hmm. Sometimes it's theirs directed at you. But that's the way in which I feel like, I would tie up all three things we're talking about: humor, the gay community, and aggression. So I immediately said, I feel like oppressed communities use humor as a self-preservation technique because they can't be overtly aggressive.
Because the consequences are too harsh. Yeah. Hey, I want to take a moment to speak with you about this channel. Currently, only 11% of viewers are subscribed to the channel. I think those numbers are terrible. So if you're enjoying this content and you want to help out the channel, please take a moment right now to like this video and subscribe. And if you really want to help out the channel, you can become a member of the Howl in the Wilderness Patreon, which will give you access to early release of full ad-free episodes, plus access to the archive of the first 100 episodes of this podcast. It would really help me out and allow me to keep creating content like the interview that you're watching right now. Okay, thanks so much. Now, back to the interview. I mean, this has been really great to get this kind of primer on Jung and psychoanalysis and all of that. I would like to get a little bit into Jung's views on homosexuality. I've always seen him as just like kind of painfully heteronormative. But you really went into his work, like you said earlier, like kind of looking for those needles in the haystack. So what did you come up with? I mean, there were a few things that you highlight in that book from '89, but what stands out the most, or what seems the most relevant?
Well, I guess what you sort of said it. I guess what seems the most relevant to me was how little he said.
Right, the absence is what's yeah.
I don't know if I would say he was painfully heteronormative, but he was definitely heteronormative. And so that was it.
Well, painful to me reading it.
Well, I mean, painful.
I'll own that.
All of us would like him to be something he wasn't, but
I know I don't need him to be that.
In a weird way, because he didn't say very much within the context of Freudian psychoanalysis, which was really the predominant theoretical orientation of the time. That's a positive, because psychoanalysts were trying to figure out what was fucked up about homosexuals from the word go. Here's 27 explanations as to what went wrong in someone's development that they became homosexual, right?
Right.
Well, Jung himself in general didn't talk about sex, period, very much at all. He was very individually focused. So he wrote one essay on marriage. So it wasn't very relationally focused either. So that was, I guess, what I found. I mean, what I found was essentially that whatever I in the book, I divide my attention to him in terms of his attitudes towards homosexuality and his theories about homosexuality. His attitudes were unrelentingly positive. I mean, he There are a couple of cases he talked about in which, there was this young gay man that came into analysis with him. He really didn't pay his homosexuality very much attention. Didn't feel like it was the reason he should be in analysis. Wasn't something he tried to quote unquote cure. So it was a very non-judgmental. Saw homosexuality perhaps as sort of a developmental stage. And so in that sense was just part of normal human development. Because he was classically educated, he had an awareness that homosexuality was a historical and cultural fact throughout time and culture, which was a larger context that most psychologists did not put it in at the time. So I actually felt like, oh, okay, he doesn't really have an explanation for it, but his attitude, he was activist in Europe as the editor of the Psychoanalytic Journal in advocating for the decriminalization of homosexuality in European countries. I mean, in that sense, he was saying, if it's anything, it's an illness. And if it's an illness, it's not a criminal act. Hmm. So I felt his attitudes were pretty positive. And that's what I write about. I just go through all 5 of them, in that sense. He felt that it has a meaning, like most psychological phenomenon. And he felt like his job as the therapist was to help the gay client, find its meaning for them in their life. And then, of course, because he was a theoretician, he came up with sort of 3 basic attitudes using his own theories as to what might explain it. And so the first, interestingly enough, was that it was constitutional. He felt like, okay, it's just sort of an inborn characteristic. It's constitution, part of someone's constitution. They're just born that way, we might say. That's pretty much the way we think about it these days, right? Rather than you're born heterosexual and something then occurs to skew you off your heterosexual trajectory, right? Jung, back in the 1920s, was saying, I think it's constitutional because it's so fundamental to someone's personality and so not amenable to psychoanalytic change that I'm just presuming it's constitutional. It's one of the reasons he didn't touch it. In the few places he actually even talks about gay cases, which are very few, maybe 3 in the course of these huge volumes. Number 2, he felt, and this was kind of like the major way he felt that he's talking only about gay men. He felt it was an incomplete detachment from the feminine archetype. It was an identification with the feminine. Now, that, I guess, there's some, if you're looking at it through those lenses, that's kind of what it looks like, right? Yeah. But that gets to your point of heteronormativity, right? If you don't have, which he didn't at the time, an idea that gender and sexual orientation is a spectrum, then if all you have is a binary male and female way of thinking about it, then you have to explain why these men want to be penetrated. And if all you have is female as your other option, then what you come up with is this theory, which is that male homosexuality is an identification with the feminine. Weirdly, the few times he talked about female homosexuality, he came up with the same explanation. That, in other words, women were attracted to women because of their identification with the feminine. They didn't have any room for the masculine. And I'm like, okay, here's like a one-size-fits-all explanation that doesn't really convince me very much. But that's within the context of what I just said. He did not spend a great deal of time looking at homosexuality. I mean, we're talking maybe a couple of passages in the course of the stuff. And then the third theoretical orientation was that he felt that homosexuality of both genders was perhaps an expression of the archetypal androgeny, that it was a combination of male and female energies in a particular person that allowed them to be bisexual / homosexual. That's I think, nowadays with all of the talk about non-binary gender identities and transgenderism, et cetera, there's an awful lot, I think, and I'll just say, again, parenthetically, the androgeny was an extraordinarily important archetype for Jung.
Yeah, because its relationship to alchemy too, right?
Correct.
Mhm.
What he felt like the androgyne or the hermaphrodite, he sometimes said the hermaphrodite using the classical term, or androgyne, he felt like that represented a union of opposites that could potentially represent an incredibly primitive, undifferentiated self, or the highest level of integration. And of course, his own theories about, his own heteronormative theories about masculinity and the anima, men having a feminine side to their personality they need to bring to consciousness and integrate, and vice versa, women having a masculine side to their personality called the animus that they need to integrate. The result of that would be a certain kind of workable psychological androgyny. Mm-hmm. So in Jung's thought, identifying homosexuality with the androgyne is an extraordinarily positive thing to say. It's like potentially what he's saying is that, I'm putting words in his mouth, but he's saying like gay people are more advanced than heterosexuals because they have a little bit more access to both archetypes of the masculine and feminine in the way that heterosexual men and homosexual women have to work at creating for themselves. So that's what Jung said, kind of in a nutshell.
Yeah. Okay. There's a lot in there. So, one of the things, like maybe James Hillman's critique of that would be that this whole union of the opposites idea and integration of the opposites, all of that, you're still starting from the presumption of this theory of the opposites. And Hillman liked to break that apart and say, like, look, there's a fundamental myth in Jungianism, and it's this separation of the opposites, union of the opposites thing. And if you just step back and you question that, you go, you know what? Maybe it is more like a spectrum, and that it's not about a union of opposites. And he brought in ideas about the union of the sames and things like that, right? What do you think about that? Like, kind of this post-Jungian take on both the contrasexual and the union of opposites idea, which is very fundamental to Jungian thought.
Well, I think it's fundamental to Jungian thought because I think it's people's experience or phenomenology. You know what I mean? I think, again, this is kind of, it would be interesting, I think, if Hillman were alive today and having the discussions we're all having with non-binary and transgender folks around what their experience is. Mm-hmm. Right. Let's just say it's non-binary. That doesn't mean that a non-binary person doesn't experience a portion of their experience as male. It's not like they're asexual. They're experiencing part of themselves as male, they're experiencing part of themselves as female, they're part of themselves as androgynous, and they're having the whole experience, right? So I think I agree with Hillman's point in the sense that you can't land that hard on the dichotomist quality of this, because I think if you do, you, as Hillman argues, you preclude experiences that really can't be described in polar fashion. There are people that have a more integrated or transitional or ambiguous experience of themselves than that, So, you summed it up by calling that heteronormative. I think that's actually true, right? So that's Jung's way of thinking is heteronormative. And Hillman makes a powerful argument for what we see today, which is to say, like, there are other ways of putting all three of those archetypes together in one human experience. And some of those are continuous. They're not split. They're not oppositional. They're sometimes talking to my grandniece, sometimes she has a male day and sometimes she has a female day and sometimes they have an androgynous day and there they are. And that's all an authentic experience of theirs, hers, right? Yeah. So that's that. And that's what I would say. I feel like now that there's more social permission for non-binary and transgender folks to speak about their experience in ways that make sense to them, not ways that fit into previous paradigms, we're hearing the truth of what he said, you know? So, but that's not to say that male, female, masculine, feminine don't exist. That's just to say that they don't necessarily have an oppositional or dichotomous, as we say, binary quality to them. So there may be levels of continuity between those experiences that now we're only finding out about because we have permission to talk about them more freely.
Yeah, I mean, one of my issues is that even masculine feminine is a man-made category. And so what I would like to do is rather just talk about qualities without putting them in one category or the other. And I think, like, coming back to what we were talking about as kind of binary thinking, idealization as a defense against complexity and anxiety and ambiguity and all that. Uh, isn't that kind of what's going on in the culture in response to kind of this post-gender movement? And like the difficulty in finding symbolic expression of something that isn't binary, like looking at the transgender flag and how that's changing and getting kind of more complex and a bit messier. And the alphabet string is just always changing, always in flux. Things are being shuffled around, things are being added. It's really difficult to symbolize or to name something that is so amorphous, complex, ever changing. And I think that's some of the struggle that we're seeing in the culture now, is this urge to want to complexify, to ambiguate, and there's a tension happening there, I think.
Could be. I mean, I guess I was going to go back to your point about whether or not male and female are man-made, quote unquote, man-made categories. One of the dissertation students I had, James Perrin, is coming out with a book from Routledge next year called The Atomum. You right? Trying to find a non-binary way of talking about the contrasexual qualities, right? And in his book, in his dissertation, what he did was, I think, really pretty comprehensive, which is why I'm glad he's getting it published. I mean, all of us really strongly encourage him to get it published. He's talking about the way in which, as a species, we're sexually anatomically dimorphous. So if you have a penis, you have an experience of that phallus or that penis. And if you have a vagina, you have an experience of that vagina. And the penis experience is not the vagina experience. Now, you can call that whatever you want to call that. We can call that flub jub and flub jam. I mean, I don't really care what you call it, but it's a dimorphous experience. And so that's what James talks about. Like, people have an experience of their anatomy on some basic level. The error, of course, is to say that that's where it all stops, and that that's determinative of the rest of anyone's gender experience, which it is not, certainly, right? Nor is that necessarily permanent, especially these
fixed.
days. Yeah, no, it is not fixed. But I mean, I think some of the binary quality of this is because just anatomically, we're anatomically dimorphic as a species. So like that, there's pieces of that I think we talk about as male and female on some basic level, right? But I think that's where, it's a spectrum, right? I mean, there's some people that are very, very identified with that and don't have the other experience. And then there are some people who over here on the other side, and some people are kind of in the middle there, right? I don't, what you're talking about, I guess, I would rather have it messy and figure that out.
Yeah, me too.
Right? Then I would rather have it messy and figure that out individually than have people, as I grew up, kind of, having to lock important basic experiences of themselves away in the closet, or attacking themselves for having a non-normative experience,
Yeah, non-conforming.
So I feel like, yeah, that's messy. I mean, again, that's where I feel like a lot of what has been written in the last 20, 30 years about gender is just like so right on. Thank God, we're talking about it. I think what you're saying in a different way is this: gender is a social construction. Indeed, it's a social construction, right? So I feel like, but so gender is a social construction, and now we have more choices of how gender can be constructed for people on the basis of their actual experience.
Yeah.
Anatomical, psychological, interpersonal, emotional, spiritual, even. So,
Mhm. Yeah, just to push back on the idea that our anatomical dimorphism naturally precludes a kind of dimorphism in categorization. Like, yeah, you can have a penis, but what does the penis mean to you? What is a penis for? How should a penis be used? I mean, all of those things are all up in the air, right? You could say the same about a vulva and, whatever else.
correct.
Yeah. So I
No,
think that's where I get
absolutely.
a bit like still itchy, like, well, yeah, because I have a penis, can I be, but what does masculine mean? That's culturally determined, right? And,
Well, that's why, in some ways, I like Jung's categories of archetypal masculine and archetypal femininity because they're not intrinsically gender related, right? I mean, if something is archetypal, then whether you identify as a man or a woman, you have access to femininity,
mhm.
right? Because it's archetypal. It doesn't matter if you identify yourself as a man or as a woman or as non-binary. If it's an archetype, if femininity is archetypal, you
It's
have some access.
available to you.
It's
Yeah.
available to you.
Hmm.
That's where I have to say, I feel like that's where, that's the plus in sort of Jung's way of holding these things. And in a way, he was a bit, as heteronormative as he was sort of a little bit ahead of his time in the sense of even suggesting that, I just think, what would he have done with the current situation? I think he probably would have welcomed it, because I
Hmm.
feel like it's kind of where he was naturally going. And just at various points when you read him around, especially around gender, you can see him hitting the limit of his ability to kind of drop what he was saying and then sort of having to backtrack, like, oh well, women should be women. And I'm like, yeah, okay, you you got to the edge of that cliff and you did not jump, my dear. So
Yeah. I mean, he's kind of ahead of his time, but only in a kind of post-Victorian European context, right? Because indigenous cultures had ideas of cross-dressing, transgenderism. It was there in the Greeks. It was in, I think, early Judaism as well. And so it was just like this kind of post-Victorian era where he was maybe trying to push things back, but in a way reclaiming some stuff from the distant past, you know.
right,
And then I
right.
think like Hillman did a good job of like kind of continually pushing that forward, allowing for more complexity, less structuralism, all of that. So I think Hillman would be really kind of both happy and disturbed by what's going on in the culture now, because with all of the added complexity, there is still so much kind of binary thinking in terms of the maybe beyond heteronormativity, but still in a kind of moralistic, judgmental, right and wrong, good and bad way. So we're still stuck in this binary thinking in a lot of cases.
I would agree. I mean, I would agree. And I also think the transgender and non-binary community is not immune from that
Oh,
dichotomous thinking
definitely
either.
not. That's what I was
Right.
talking. I was speaking directly to that. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, like, whoa, okay, because I've been on the receiving end of that a few times. I'm like, oh, okay, well, so much for non-binary. That's pretty black or white there, ain't it? So, yeah, I would
Oh,
agree. I don't know, again, it's good, I think, to know what these folks from the past largely said and how they held them, because I do think, as we kind of conclude here, right? I think it's good to get us. It's good to kind of step into their way of thinking, because I think it helps give us a perspective on where we are now. How things have changed, what wasn't even thinkable then and is thinkable now. And as they say in AA, take what you like and leave the rest. I mean, I think there's an awful lot of um accuracy in their perceptions of what's happening psychologically for people. And I think that's where, all of my career and then the subsequent career of the folks whose dissertations I've sat on the committee for, and my students and my supervisors, I like, yeah, take these concepts and let's put them to use. Let's put them to use in a contemporary way. And if they allow us to speak in a creative and deeper way about everyone's experience, then yeah, let's use them. And when they don't, just leave them there. that's like, I don't, that's, again, to go back to the beginning of what we talked about, like, so I'm kind of not a Jungian. I'm like,
Mhm.
okay, I think I find a lot of worth in Jung, but it's not like I pledge allegiance to the Jungian flag. I mean, I'm happy to kind of just, yeah, okay, he was not right on that. Let's move on. Same with Hillman's. There's some
Mhm.
of the stuff in Hillman. I'm just like, yeah, okay, that's great, but some of it is very insightful. Some of it is very useful. It's, puts words to images to, gives you tools to work with some of this stuff in a very creative and important way that other languages, other ways of thinking don't. So
Mhm.
that's why I'm happy to come and talk about Jung and sort of what I've done with it in my career, what I continue to do with it, and what some of the folks following me are going to be doing with it,
Mhm.
in the decades to come, I hope.
Mhm. Yeah, I think one of the things I appreciate about Hillman, without being like a Hillmanian, is that he never stops challenging me. And so I think even that, the function of that, the usefulness of that, just kind of like having someone kind of challenge certain dogmatic ideas, accepted ideas, just to kind of shake things up, and then you can make up your own mind once you've been shooken up and had some time with it, right?
Right.
Or to
Well,
stay
one
ambivalent, actually, is, so not even like, picking a side or something, but choosing to be ambivalent, I mean, is next level in my opinion.
another plug for another, recent book in which Hillman's work is key. And, really, I think, though I'm not a big fan, as you could probably tell, I thought, like, wow, what a use of James Hillman in this particular topic. Is my colleague at Pacifica, Douglas Thomas, wrote a book that just came out this last year called A Deep Psychology of BDSM,
Hmm.
in which he's looking at BDSM, primarily gay male BDSM, but not exclusively. And Hillman and that topic are made for one another. What Doug does with that, I mean, Hillman's entire attitude toward illness and suffering as a necessary part of psychic development is tailor made, is the only person I can think of Doug would ever be able to use to enlighten what BDSM is for the practitioners
Mhm.
in their own psychological development and individuation process. Yeah, I've reviewed it for Psychological Perspectives, the Jung Institute, LA Jung Institute journal. And that's what I said. I was just like, as someone who's not a huge fan of Hillman, it was no pun intended, masterful, a masterful use.
Thank you, Daddy Hillman.
So that's what I would say. I feel like,
Oh, that,
so like, even as you're
yeah.
saying, I mean, there's a lot in James Hillman that I think, again, can be used quite creatively and applied to the contemporary situation to provide insight in ways that nothing else would be able to, really.
Hmm.
No one else has been able to. So
Well, thanks for bringing Douglas's work in. I'll check it out. I was gonna, I'd made a note when you mentioned BDSM in the beginning, and I was gonna ask about your take on it, what's going
yeah,
on there, what's being played out. But I'm gonna contact Douglas.
yeah,
That's
do. I
that's
can send,
great.
I'll send you his email address. Yeah.
Yeah. Now, just as we wrap up, is there anything going on in psychologic, in kind of like the psychological world in writing that you don't think has been given enough attention yet, that you'd still like to see some more work done on? Specifically around like gay male issues, or homosexuality.
Well, I guess they're interesting. I mean, I think, much as I love Doug's book, I kind of feel like it's the first book in what really should be a literature on BDSM within gay male culture. I
Hmm.
mean, I do feel like I wrote one article 30 years ago about it, and Doug's this book is on it. I think, in general, that's what I would say. I mean, like, that's one topic that I think all of us gay men within the conventional gay culture have a ton of experience with, contact with, interest in, participation in, and very little has actually been written, except for, like, first person stories of like how I became a leather master, blah, blah, blah. And it's, I think, very interesting because I guess the practitioners I know are incredibly thoughtful, reflective, and articulate about it.
And self-aware.
Right. And so I'm like, okay, I mean, there's, I think some of these folks should be doing podcasts on a regular basis, right? Because that sort of is ensconced within this larger, I think, education about human sexuality in general. That's been part of my career as a sex educator and a sex therapist, right? I just think there are aspects of human sexual experience we just haven't really talked about very much. So when it comes to my community, the imagery and the experience of BDSM play, quote unquote play, just all over the place. So that's one. And interestingly enough, I guess I would say, sort of having a theological education and, having been married to a sociologist of religion, and of course, Jung created the field of psychology of religion along with Henry James, right? I feel like there's an awful lot about, and then maybe, to sort of say that gay men's alienation from conventional forms of religious practice due to the homophobia of particularly the Christian church, but not just the Christian church, certainly aspects of Judaism, Islam, etc. I would love to work on, be part of, read some really cogent and profound and real depth-oriented reflections on spirituality. Like, what is it about, once upon a time, again, just before I talk to you, this man who's sort of doing this research on Purusha, Peter Larkin, film director, was talking about Purusha as sort of a gay male sex guru from the early 80s, right? There was at a time a whole idea that, gay men have a particular calling to mediate spirit for the culture in general, right?
Oh, yeah.
Certainly, third gender persons in tribal cultures have certainly served that purpose. Not, non-binary, third gendered, homosexually oriented shamans have done that across cultures, etc. So I feel like there's a way in which gay male spirituality just doesn't get talked about a whole lot. I feel like and most of the stuff that I read is just like, diatribes against Christianity, and I'm like, can't we get past that?
Right, like only dealing with the shadow aspect. Yeah.
Which, God knows.
Let's deal with it. Yeah.
I'm an active practicing Roman Catholic. I have conversations with my own Roman Catholic spiritual director every month about my experience of God as interpreted by Roman Catholic theology, my spirituality, their positive experiences. I feel like there's an awful lot even in that tradition, which not known for its, gay affirmative attitude, right? There's an awful lot even in that, if you have an open space and can explore it, could be said. But the moment you say religion, I feel like, it's like Himmler. He's like, the moment someone say culture, reach for my gun. The moment I say religion in a gay male environment, poof, everyone's rage just goes off. Yeah. And it's impossible to have a discussion about it. So I'm like, that's the other topic. I'd be like, it's not that, everyone I see as a client and everyone even who's enraged about it is enraged about it because there's a spirituality they experience that they haven't had a chance to put words to or practice freely. Like there's a tremendous amount of healing that needs to get done. Yeah. And so I feel like that's one of the reasons why I'd like to talk about it. I feel like that's the other issue. The other issue is, what is our relationship to spirit as homosexually oriented men and women? What's your experience? What's my experience? Let's talk about how we've experienced the transcendent through our love and our sexual experiences, right? I mean, in Roman Catholic theology, marriage is a sacrament. It's a sacrament because sexuality is a modality of an avenue toward direct and immediate contact with the divine. What does that look like for a gay man?
When it's procreative.
Not only. Like, again, in Roman Catholic theology, sex is understood as both procreative and unitive. it's an expression of love. And in fact, it's a unitive aspect is the first thing that's mentioned in the catechism. It's an expression of love. Then it's a modality of life. But first, it's an expression of love. Now, indeed, the church obviously has inverted those for all kinds of obvious political and cultural reasons. But if you go to the actual catechism, that's the order in which they're listed. Because what's understood is if God doesn't love, there cannot be life. Right. Like life only happens after the love. So sex is unitive. Consequently, sex is sacramental. Now, I've had sacramental experiences of sex as a gay man with another man, right? And no one can tell me I haven't because I'm the one having the experience, right? Yeah. So I know it's possible. And I can tell you, every gay man I've ever talked to has had some experience of sex with another man that they would call transcendent of some sort. Something greater than themselves was going on that they only experienced in that experience sexually with that person. Might not have been often, might have only been once, might not have even been something they could even put words to or become aware of, right? I'm privileged as a therapist.
Probably ineffable, yeah.
Right? I'm privileged as a therapist to be able to give people the space to kind of put words to that, right? I think it's a huge unexplored area that I think would be an enormous, enormous healing to my community. Because obviously, right, the traditional forms of religious practice and theology are making no room for that kind of discussion at all. That doesn't mean it isn't happening. I know it's happening. And so it would be really nice to be able to kind of create some kind of a space for it. You know, I have a space for it in my life, thank God, through, you know, a very understanding out gay spiritual director. But, you know, that's what I would say. So when you say, what else would I like to see? I'd really like to see that field be opened up so that people can talk about how their sexuality could be and has been transcendent for them. Because without that discussion, then it ends up being just this kind of repetitive biological function or something that they eventually lose interest in. It's not an engine for their individuation as it could be if they opened up the vertical access to what it could allow them to experience as opposed to just the horizontal or the interpersonal. So that's a little bit, you know.
Well, and that's good.
Yeah, but other podcast.
Yeah, but that's great because one of the things that Jung talked about in terms of homosexuality was that it has a meaning peculiar to the individual in question, and psychological growth consists of becoming aware of that meaning for the individual. So I was going to ask you, like, what's the meaning in one's homosexuality? And so you're pointing to that there. If we can make a connection to the relationship between sexual union and transcendence or the vertical dimension, therein lies the meaning. Yeah.
Because often then sex ends up for gay men being, I would say, meaningless.
Yeah.
Like,
right.
in other words, right? I mean,
and ultimately unfulfilling if it's meaningless. And so promiscuity and yeah.
Absolutely. I see it all the time. I mean, that's what gay men are walking in hungry for, right?
Hungry for meaning. Yeah.
They're hungry for making their sexuality mean something, not just sort of a form of entertainment or distraction or the relief of a biological urge.
Right. And so if it lacks that vertical dimension, I mean, maybe this is just taking it one step too far, but then like kind of fetish culture could be seen as a form of idolatry, like getting kind of caught up in the objectification, right? Rather than the transcendent.
What a fetish is. I mean, that's what the original
fetish
word
object, yeah.
Fetish means. It means
okay, so I'm not breaking any new ground with my thinking on my feet here, but
well, no, no, you're right. But I feel like you're right. I mean, to say that is to remind folks in my community of what sexuality could be and isn't. Because, you know, when we say fetish, we're talking about a sacred object with it. You know, when you say an idol, so to speak, we're talking about something that is a sacred object. Well, I can guarantee you that unless you're a particularly well-evolved BDSM practitioner, you're not thinking about this as a sacred act or ritual.
Yeah.
You're thinking about this in the very transactional ways that we think about it in contemporary sexuality and contemporary culture, right? Some do, some do. It's certainly
Mhm.
possible to. And even if it doesn't even have a fetishistic aspect to it, there are definitely couples that see their sexual union as a sacramental experience, what I would call in my Catholic tradition, a sacramental experience. That is to say, an outward sign of an inward grace, right? I mean, it's an action that one undertakes in order to have a direct and immediate experience of the divine. And so, yeah, I mean, I belonged for many years to Most Holy Redeemer, Roman Catholic parish in the middle of the Castro, with 90% GLBTQ parishioners. I mean, almost all of those folks would say that their sexual relationship with their partners are sacramental, whether the
Mhm.
church calls it sacramental or it doesn't call it sacramental. I know what a sacrament feels like. I receive a sacrament every time I go to mass. I know what a sacrament
Oh,
is. Thank you very much. So this
I
is what
thought,
I have to say. Like,
yeah.
no one is consulting us about our experience. So anyway,
And if Catholicism isn't the most homoerotic religion on earth, I don't know what tops it.
for better or for worse, right? Unfortunately, for worse, because it hasn't been for better, right? I mean, that's the cure, right? The cure for all of this would be to actually put into place a positive theology of same-sex love, right?
Right,
And
to
then,
redeem homosexuality in the eyes of the church.
well, then we wouldn't have what we've had for the last 50 some years of, sexually abusive experiences that have been played out within a castrated priesthood. I mean, it's
Yeah.
just, that's just the Catholic Church. It's not like the other, you know, Christian denominations or even other traditions beyond Christian don't have their own issues with all of it. That's what I'd
Yeah.
say. When you say, like, what else would I like to see? I'd be like, well, I would love to see a sort of gay spirituality discussion of, real people's experience, how the tradition could be used and applied, and to help folks come to a certain kind of spiritual wholeness and to.
Yeah, I feel you with that. And beyond like the kind of Unitarian rainbow flag acceptance thing, but like deep theological, philosophical discussions around the implications of one's sexuality, especially like non-heteronormative sexuality and their spiritual life. Yeah.
Well, I would start with people's experience, but again, until you have a space where people can actually speak freely about what they've actually experienced, none of that's going to happen. So
Mhm. Have you
anyway,
read Camille Paglia's writing on homosexuality and Catholicism and spirituality?
I haven't. If I did, I was many years ago. So
I mean, she's one of my favorite psychological writers, non-professional psychological writers, but she does the only kind of writing I think that's talking about what you're talking about, that redemption of the homosexual in the context of Judeo-Christianity in particular. So I'll maybe send you some stuff. There's a really good essay in Vamps and Tramps.
a nice Italian girl.
Yeah, with a big mouth. I love her.
They all have big mouths. We all have big mouths. Well, it's
Well,
been fun,
Rob,
Brian.
Rob, it's been so great. Thanks so much for sharing so much time with us and sharing like all of your thoughts on this. It's been really enlightening for me. I really appreciate it.
Cool. Cool.